Hi, my name is Tesney. Today, let's talk about cards on controller. They're a pain in the ass. I use macros and I also target players directly, but macros in combat are less than ideal for many reasons, so if I am using them, I want to make sure they are necessary and that I'm using the least awful macros. My standards are so high, aren't they? The least awful option. Targeting players on controller has always been a bit unsmooth. It wasn't really a problem during Stormblood because not every card was played, and the ones that were, we could use some of them without targeting. Think Divination, because that's what replaced that mechanic. In Shadowbringers, the card game changed entirely. Functionally, we wind up with so many cards to play, and each of these cards needs a direct target. The changes to draw and play allow us to hold cards, which change the timing of cards as well. We went from once every 30 seconds like clockwork to hold. Okay, now double maul right now! Therein lies the problem for controller players. I think most of us can navigate the player list to play a card inside of a normal global. I can definitely do that twice a minute. It's completely doable. I analyzed some of my footage targeting other players on both PS4 and PS5. The PS5 performs and looks better overall, but targeting the party and dealing with UI elements feels the same on both consoles. It takes 0.15 seconds to slide from one player to the next in the party list. There's an input delay built in, and trying to go faster than that is a gamble, where the loss is putting balance on the scholar. So reliability is key. To reach the Samurai P5 takes at least 0.85 seconds, more realistically a whole second. Inside of a normal single weave Malefic, this is doable. If Astrologians could survive on single weaves, we would. But we can't. 3 out of every 4 cards needs to be played during the divination window, double weaves, under light speed. My best case scenario of 0.85 seconds applied to a double weave looks like this. Best case scenario, I'm clipping that global by 0.3 seconds, each card. Almost 1 second out of every 2 minutes. Over the course of the fight, that's several globals gone. Not to mention the RSI of all that arrow smashing. To play a card on the Samurai is 6 button presses, plus the double woven ability that comes after, for a grand total of 7 button presses in one global. Let's say in that same burst window, I also card the 2 casters, P8 and P7. In those 2 globals, another 11 presses that must be all reliably done. It's not like we can't press those buttons fast enough. How many real-time maneuvers have we done now? This is why it doesn't work for me. I have tried a few times to ditch the macros and just try to learn it by targeting directly, but the UI limits how fast we can go. Macros. I started using macros at the beginning of Shadowbringers, and they have served me well. However, macros have best practices and a host of disadvantages. The first and worst of these is action queuing. Abilities and actions can be queued to execute like so. Good enough timing is actually good enough. As long as the ability is keyed within that window, it'll get timed properly by the server to end as soon as the action lock for the previous ability ends, and you keep full uptime. The windows are potentially larger, but this is reliable. Macros, however, do not get this luxury. Each line of text gets tossed at the server, and if it can process the action, it does, and if it can't, tough cookies. To simulate queuing, we can copy lines of text in the hopes that one will get picked up. But without actual queuing, the timing for macros is different and tighter than a regular ability press. Rolling the global is imperative, and the most reliable way to do that is button spam. Macros really get in the way of that. However, off globals like cards have a little more flexibility. The first possible opportunity to execute the macro is right as the cast bar ends and not before. For a double weave instant cast spell, the card macro in the first weave spot looks like this. Tight but doable. Quite a bit more comfortable than targeting via the party list. I don't generally use a macro for the second weave. For the most part, our card rotation has us double weaving pairs of play and draw, so that's the timing and muscle memory I've gotten used to. Since timing is important, I do hyperfixate on making sure everything gets out during the burst window. If I ghost a play macro by going too fast, then draw overwrites that card. And because abilities queue, that direct input draw will always be executed. The next issue is the sheer quantity of macros needed. Astrologian is already heavy on button bloat, so having 8 macros for 8 players is a complete non-starter. I have seen macro systems that involve cross hotbar changes. One macro press switches to a hidden hotbar with a macro for each player, and each play macro has a hotbar change command inside of it that brings you back to the original. However, I have shied from the system because the extra UI elements and handling stress me out, and because I don't need 8 macros. When I'm playing Astrologian, odds are good I'm raiding. I switch to other jobs for other things for variety's sake, so while I do need options for all party sizes, my bread and butter is standard full party. In a raid setting, there's no need for macros on the first 4 members of the party list. P1 is me. I can card myself without switching targets, not that I want to, but I can. P2, P3 is the tank, not an ideal card target. The warrior might tell you otherwise, but we don't need a macro to put the card on him. P4 is my co-healer buddy. P5 to P8 are the DPS sorted generally from melee to ranged. I took this one step further by sorting my party list to reflect FF log statistics. P5 and P6 should be melee, P7, P8 should be ranged. P5 specifically will be my best melee target, P8 will be my best ranged. These two I want to use every single burst window, craptastic RNG notwithstanding. In that burst window I will either need P6 and or P7 depending on the card. Ideally, I'm only using this macro once every 2 minutes. Instead of remembering who goes where and what number in the list they are, I just remember my priority. Second melee card drawn, that's my second melee macro. Stacked comps of 3 melee or 3 ranged are hard no matter how you put cards on them. All I can say is good luck. You'll need it. However, I can't leave myself out of luck in dungeons. I have tried to set up 2 separate cross hotbars that were identical save the card macros, one for raids and the other for dungeons. But too often, I would muscle memory my way back to the wrong hotbar. In a dungeons, the raid macros don't work at all. In a raid, the dungeon macros put cards on tanks and healers. It was awkward no matter what I did, so I abandoned it in favor of these more flexible and only slightly dangerous macros, like this. In dungeons, the P8 gets ignored all the way to the end, and only the P4 picks up. Same for P5, P3. It should be the same either way. There is a chance, however, that the first 14 lines of the macro fail in a raid, thus tossing arrow on the off tank. However, this macro can be made reliable with tight timings, waiting until the animation lock for the previous spell is completed before executing the macro. The last time it happened, I knew I was going too fast and I did it anyways. We were almost at the end of our first P1 clear, so I got impatient, which caused a mistake. However, I'll own that as my mistake and not the fault of a macro. Other macros. Many healers, even keyboard and mouse players, use macros for resurrections. I do not use text in my macros. The communication element is potentially helpful, but having text in a macro means it can't be spammed without embarrassing myself. I have practiced resing without macros and I don't quote-unquote need them anymore, but it is nice to have a one-button res for casual situations. Macros aren't optimal, but someone else already put you in a non-optimal situation when they decided to tank the floor. I have played around with a priority system resing macro as well, but there's no one-size-fits-all approach because party members and priorities change depending on who is dead. I made these lazy macros for resing P2 to P4 and P5 to P8, but since I never made a point to learn the hotbar changes and keybinds, I can't use them quickly enough to make them worthwhile. Mostly they're nice for alliance raids. And res macros are not without their drawbacks. Resurrection is a global, so to use a swift cast res macro, it must be timed near perfectly to keep the global rolling, or it will clip and cause you a small DPS loss. The other drawback is, if swift cast is not available, that macro has a whole second of dead time built in, and in a situation of multiple reses, that adds up and can make your part of recovery so much more stressful. So even with a macro, it's still a good idea to have all these buttons on your bar as regular abilities. Which for Astrologian is easier said than done. I have all extra bar options enabled. I'm not going to pretend that my UI is all that great. It's not. But I managed to squeeze in all abilities, roll, action, sprint, mount, limit, break, ethers, and pots into my bars, as well as the 4 macros for cards. If you haven't already, I would suggest moving your direct AoE heals to a back page hotbar. They don't have a cooldown to watch for, they don't require targeting, and they're supposed to be a last resort anyway. For a while, I did use a macro for Earthly Star and Sacred Soil, but I stopped using them after the Endwalker changes to ground targeting abilities. Double tapping an ability to use it instead of tap an X doesn't seem like it would be that much of a big improvement, but it kind of was. Between that and the insane size of New Star, I don't find it necessary anymore. Ground target abilities are often laggy and harder to weave, and using a macro can help with that. The command GT off disables the targeting ring in a macro, which can perform better than a direct input in some situations. The right answer is to try everything and see what works. Macros for other abilities. Some abilities are smoother to use and queue behind global casts. Actions like Celestial Opposition, Draw, Essential Dignity all queue quite reliably. There's not much risk of losing them by pressing the buttons too quickly during a cast. They'll queue. A macro will only slow these down and make these harder to use. And tying an easy-to-use ability to a harder-to-use macro is just making life more difficult than it needs to be. Harder-to-use abilities. Some ground effects, abilities, pet actions, and role actions are spongier because they don't queue as nicely, and they are more likely to disappear if used too early compared to others. Timing them is tighter. Sprint will not execute unless pressed after the cast bar ends. Same with food and potions. Despite needing to time these the same as a macro, I still wouldn't recommend relying on a macro for them. The UI was designed for direct inputs. That will always be the most reliable way to play. But I feel like Astrologian cards fell through the cracks of game design. Perhaps it was only play-tested for keyboard mouse players. Perhaps it was tested on controller and the person who approved it was a sadist. I mean, if you're rating savage, then you're obviously a masochist. But make sure your suffering is the right kind of suffering. Using an ability shouldn't be the hard part of a fight. Macros can be a crutch, but in the case of cards, I think the system is broken and that macros are a coping mechanism. We wouldn't be reaching for convoluted solutions if it wasn't a problem. I believe that. And I believe that macros for cards are a valid response to a real design problem. If you find that macros work for you, then great, it works for you, and I'm glad you found a solution. And if you think my macros might help you, then I hope you'll try them out. Try everything, keep what works. Thank you for watching.